The Rust told stories, not the kind carved into war memorials or spoken at diplomatic tables. Just quiet, ugly stories about heat and cold and decades of hard use that nobody had ever bothered to fix because the ship kept flying anyway. The UES Resolute sat in berth 9 of Outpost Farron like something that had been forgotten, which, in most official records, it had been. 91 years old, patched in 40 places. One engine running 3% hotter than spec, because a replacement part had been on order for 6 years. Chief Engineer Ross did not mind the rust. He had grown up on a fishing trawler in the North Sea, and he knew the difference between metal that was dying and metal that was just tired. The Resolute was tired. It was not dying. He walked the hull every morning with a magnetic scanner and a cup of water, not coffee, just water, because he said hot drinks made his hands unsteady, and he talked to the ship the way some people talk to old dogs, quietly, without expecting an answer. Weapons Officer Nara was running calibration checks on the forward gun array when the alien convoy came in. She heard them before she saw them on scope, not with her ears, but in the way the comms traffic spiked, and the port authority started using formal language instead of the usual casual shorthand. That only happened when someone important arrived. She looked up through the viewport and saw them. 3 Kreth Dominion warships, angular and dark, their hulls plated in layered composites that caught the station lights like black mirrors. Behind them, 2 Yundari-packed frigates, long and tapered, the kind of ships that were designed to look fast even when they were standing still. They were beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, deliberately, aggressively, as if beauty were a threat. And then there was the Resolute, sitting in berth 9, one running light flickering. Admiral Vorak of the Kreth Dominion walked the docking level with 2 aides and a translator unit clipped to his collar. He was tall, broad across the chest, with a ridge of hardened cartilage running from his brow to the back of his skull, a feature that Kreth males developed in adulthood and which in their culture indicated both age and status. He had seen human ships before, newer ones, cleaner ones. He stopped when he saw the Resolute. He looked at it for a long time. Then he made a sound that his translator rendered as laughter, though it came out of his chest rather than his throat. His aide pulled out a recording device. Vorak said something in Kreth that the translator caught as, "Document this. They will not believe us at home." He looked at the Resolute the way someone looks at a joke whose punchline has already been delivered. The humans sent a relic to guard their border. Perhaps when the fighting starts, they will throw the bolts at us. His aides laughed. A group of Yundari officers nearby turned to look and then joined in, though they had not heard the words. The laughter was enough. Nara heard all of it. She had a good ear for tone even when she could not catch every word. She did not say anything. She went back to her calibration work and tightened a connection that did not strictly need tightening. Rost had been under the portside hull panel when the convoy arrived. He came out, wiped his hands, and watched Vorak's group from 30 meters away. He heard the laughter. He took a small notebook from his chest pocket, actual paper, which he preferred because screens died in electromagnetic interference and paper did not, and he wrote something down. Not the insult, just the name. Vorak. And next to it, a small mark he used when he wanted to remember something. Captain Dara Wick was in the operations center when the distress signal came in. It was not a loud arrival. It came through as a low-priority automated beacon, the kind that a ship fires when its crew is too hurt or too busy to send a proper call. The source coordinates placed it inside the Varath corridor, a narrow channel between 3 asteroid fields that no pilot with options ever chose to fly. The kind of place ships went when they had no other choice. She pulled the data. A Kreth science vessel, registry number partial, last known heading toward a study site in the corridor's interior. The beacon had been active for 47 minutes before anyone flagged it. She checked the board. Every capable vessel in range was either days out or bound by the compact's non-intervention clauses in the contested zone adjacent to the corridor. Every vessel except one. She did not spend a long time thinking about it. That was something people who did not know her always got wrong about her. They assumed that because she moved slowly and spoke slowly, she also decided slowly. She did not. She had already decided before she picked up the ship-wide comm. Rost, Nara, get the crew aboard. She looked at the coordinates again. We leave in 40 minutes. Rost, still on the docking level, heard her voice through the comm unit on his belt. He put his notebook back in his pocket. He looked once more at the spot where Vorak had been standing, already gone now, back aboard his clean and gleaming ship. Then he picked up his kit and walked back to the Resolute. The berth crew watched them go. Nobody said anything official, but one of the port technicians, a young woman who had worked berth 9 for 3 years and knew the Resolute better than most of its own crew, reached up as the docking clamps released and put her hand flat against the hull for just a moment. The way you touch something you want to come back. The Resolute moved. Nobody had mapped the Varath corridor completely. 3 survey teams had tried. 2 came back with partial data and stories they told quietly, and 1 did not come back at all. The asteroid fields on either side were not stable. They shifted, collided, shed fragments, and occasionally swallowed entire lanes that had been clear the week before. Navigation inside the corridor was less about plotting a course and more about reading what the rock was doing right now and staying ahead of it. Dara had a printed chart from a survey done 11 years ago. She also had live sensor feed from the Resolute's forward array. She used both at the same time, cross-referencing with a pencil, which Nara found alarming until she understood that the pencil marks were not guesses, they were corrections. The chart showed where the lanes had been. The sensors showed where they were. Dara was drawing the difference. 40 meters clearance on the port approach, Rost reported from the engineering console. He was watching the hull stress readings the way a doctor watches a patient's breathing. Steady, manageable. She's handling it. The Resolute moved through the corridor's outer edge at 1/3 speed, which was slower than it felt from inside. The asteroids here were large, some the size of buildings, some the size of small towns, and they turned slowly in the weak gravitational eddies between the fields. The ship threaded between them with a precision that had nothing to do with automation. The Resolute's nav assist was 17 years old and had 3 known blind spots in its proximity calculation. Dara flew it manually. On the scopes, at a distance of roughly 4 kilometers, the Kreth science vessel came into view. It was not moving. It was wedged, not physically but tactically, between 2 other ships that had positioned themselves on its flanks so that any attempt to accelerate would put it in their line of fire. The 2 flanking ships were Yundari in design, but their registry codes came back as unregistered. No faction markings. No official call signs. Nara ran the ship profiles against her database and found a 94% match to Yundari-packed 3rd-generation light attack vessels, the kind that were officially decommissioned 8 years ago and had since appeared in various places, where someone with money and a grievance needed fast, deniable firepower. One of the flanking ships opened a channel without being asked. The voice that came through was calm in the way that people are calm when they have already decided what they are going to do and are only speaking as a formality. Unidentified vessel. You are entering a restricted operation zone. Withdraw immediately or be considered a hostile participant. Dara looked at the channel indicator. Then she looked at the Kreth science vessel on her scope, still motionless, still alive. Its power readings showed it was intact, crew probably sheltering in the reinforced interior sections. Then she looked at the 2 flanking ships. She keyed the channel. We are not going anywhere. There was a pause. Then the voice came back and the calm had changed slightly, not into anger but into something that was almost curiosity, the kind that comes just before contempt. Your vessel is not a threat. You have 30 seconds to reverse course. Nara was not listening to the conversation. She had been working during it. The forward targeting array on the Resolute required manual calibration because the automated synchronization system had failed 14 months ago and the replacement parts were still on order, same as the engine component. Manual calibration was slower. It was also more precise. Nara had been doing it every day for 14 months. She was very good at it now. The 2 rogue ships did not fire in those 30 seconds. That was their mistake. They were performing the way predators sometimes perform before a kill, showing dominance, giving the smaller thing a chance to run so that the chase could be satisfying. They expected the old human ship to turn. They wanted it to turn. It would have made a better story. The Resolute did not turn. Instead it fired, not at the rogue ships but at a cluster of loose rock debris 40 degrees above the engagement plane. The shot was precise. Not an explosion, just a hard kinetic impact at exactly the right angle. The debris cluster broke apart and the fragments spread outward in a calculated fan. 2 house-sized chunks dropped on an arc that put them directly into the port flank of the nearer rogue ship. Not enough to destroy it. Enough to shear off the port engine housing and send it spinning 30 degrees off its position. The second rogue ship opened fire immediately, and this was where the Resolute's age became something other than a disadvantage. Modern targeting systems used active sensor locks. They painted a target, tracked its profile signature, and adjusted fire solutions in real time. This worked extremely well on modern ships, which had clean, symmetrical hull profiles that sensors could track cleanly. The Resolute's hull profile was not clean. It had been patched and repatched over 91 years by people who used whatever material was available, and the resulting surface was electromagnetically inconsistent in a way that no one had ever bothered to correct because it had never seemed important. Sensor systems tracking the Resolute saw 3 slightly different ships in slightly different positions, overlapping and contradicting each other. The rogue ship's first 3 shots missed, not by much, but in a debris field not by much was enough. The shots hit rock and scattered. Dara pushed the Resolute forward, closing the distance to the rogue ships rather than increasing it. At close range, the targeting problem got worse for the enemy and better for Nara. "I have a solution on the second ship," Nara said. Her voice was even. This was a thing people noticed about Nara. She was loudest in calm moments and quietest in dangerous ones, as if the danger turned some internal volume knob down toward stillness. "Hold," Dara said. She was watching the first rogue ship, the one that had lost its port engine. It was still maneuvering, damaged but not done. "Wait for the drift." The damaged ship turned on its remaining engine, trying to reorient. As it did, it moved into a position directly behind its partner. The 2 rogue ships briefly aligned on the same axis, a gap of less than 200 meters between them. "Now," Dara said. Nara fired once. The shot went through the gap between them, missing both ships, and struck a dense iron-nickel asteroid on the far side. The ricochet was not an accident. It hit the second rogue ship on the dorsal spine at an angle that would have been nearly impossible to calculate without knowing exactly what that asteroid was made of. Nara had known. She had scanned it 11 minutes ago. The second ship's engine stuttered. It did not go dark, but it slowed and it turned, and for the first time the rogue formation broke. The Kreth science vessel, seeing an opening on its starboard side, began to move. The inside of the rogue ship's bridge was not a place built for surprises. Commander Hain had run 6 successful operations in the past 2 years. Clean operations, fast ones. The kind where the target either surrendered quickly or died quickly and the paperwork afterward was simple. He had built his reputation on reading situations correctly, on knowing which ships were dangerous and which ships were not. He had looked at the Resolute's profile data before entering the corridor. He had made a decision. He was now realizing, in the slow and unpleasant way that wrong decisions reveal themselves, that the decision had been bad. "Damage report," he said, and his voice was controlled because he had trained it to be controlled. But the 2 officers nearest him moved slightly away, the way people do near things they expect to explode. "Port engine housing gone. Maneuvering on starboard only. Targeting lock degraded. The human ship's hull profile is producing false returns." "The second ship." "Dorsal sensors damaged. They are attempting to reorient." Hain looked at his scope. The Resolute was still coming. It was not retreating. It was not calling for help. It was closing the distance with the patient, grinding confidence of something that had decided this was where the fight was going to be and had made its peace with that. This was not how old ships were supposed to behave. He gave the order to fire everything. The Resolute took the first salvo on its forward section. 3 direct hits in 5 seconds. The hull did not break. The old layered composite plating, which had been installed in sections over several decades and was therefore inconsistent in thickness and composition, absorbed the shots differently than a uniform modern hull would have. 2 impacts transferred cleanly into the outer layer. The third punched through into a cargo section that Rost had evacuated 20 minutes ago, because he had seen the attack vectors developing and decided the cargo could be replaced. 2 decks lost atmosphere. The emergency seal system, entirely mechanical, no electronics involved, closed the breached sections in 4 seconds. There was a sound like a door being slammed very hard by someone very large, and then the ship kept moving. On the Kreth science vessel, a young researcher named Oken pressed his face to the viewport and watched. He had been studying asteroid mineral composition for 3 years on this posting. He understood material science. He watched the Resolute take that salvo and he could not understand what he was seeing. The physics of it did not match his expectations. He said, to no one in particular, "Why is it not breaking?" One of the Kreth bridge crew, older, who had served on ships for 20 years, answered without looking up from his console. Because it was not built to be perfect. It was built to survive. Oken did not fully understand this answer. He would think about it for a long time afterward. Rost was running, not in panic, in the specific, purposeful way of someone executing a plan they had already made. He had 3 teams moving through the ship. One sealing the breached cargo sections, one rerouting the plasma conduit that had ruptured in the 3rd impact, and one doing something that had never been done outside of a training drill, which was activating the Resolute's tertiary power grid. The tertiary grid was so old that its activation switches were physical levers, not digital inputs. It existed because the engineers who built the Resolute in the early period of human spaceflight had survived 2 wars where ships died because a single software failure took out every linked system at once. They had decided, with the quiet stubbornness of people who had buried friends, that this would never happen on their ships. So they built backups for the backups, and then they built backups for those, and they made the final layer entirely mechanical so that nothing could crash it. The tertiary grid came on with a low hum that Rost felt in his back teeth. Half the lights on the ship changed color, from white to a warm amber that the original builders had chosen for psychological reasons, because amber light in an emergency was calmer than red. The ship's systems that had flickered in the impact stabilized. Engines, Dara's voice came through the comm. Full thrust available, Rost said. He was already moving to the next problem. The plasma reroute will hold for 40 minutes. After that, I need 10 minutes and a new coupling. You have 20 and 5. Understood. Nara had been watching the second rogue ship through the whole exchange, and she had noticed something. The ship had been trying to reorient for 3 minutes now, and it was not succeeding cleanly. The dorsal sensor damage she had caused was worse than the external readings suggested. The ship was navigating partially blind on its upper hemisphere, relying on its lower sensors to compensate. This created a predictable pattern in its movement. It always turned the same way when threatened from above because below was what it could see clearly. She told Dara. Dara processed this for approximately 2 seconds. Then she pulled the Resolute into a steep climb relative to the engagement plane, not fast. The ship could not do fast, but high enough to put them in the second rogue ship's blind hemisphere. The ship turned exactly as Nara had predicted. It always turned toward safety, which meant it always turned the same way, which meant it was predictable. And predictable things in a fight were already losing. The Resolute came down on a steep angle. Nara had already identified the target, the central power coupling on the second ship's dorsal spine, a design feature of Yundari third-generation vessels that their own engineers had flagged as a vulnerability in internal reviews 8 years ago. The reviews had been classified. Nara had found a copy in an intercepted data packet 6 months back and had been carrying the information ever since, the way you carry an umbrella in a city that rains often. She fired once. The round was small by naval standards, a single kinetic penetrator, nothing explosive. It hit the coupling at the precise angle required. The second rogue ship went completely dark. No explosion, no fire, just silence and then the slow rotation of a ship with no engine control drifting in the corridor's gravitational eddies. The first rogue ship, still maneuvering on one engine, saw this. Haynes saw it. He had fired everything he had at an old human ship, and it was still flying. He had watched his partner vessel go dark from a single shot. He was now alone, running on one engine, in a debris field, being approached by something that had been hit 3 times and was still coming. He did something he had not done in 6 operations. He turned around and ran. The Resolute did not chase him. There was no need. The Kreth science vessel was clear. Both rogue ships were neutralized, and the corridor for the moment was quiet. Rost sat down on the floor of the engineering section, his back against a conduit housing, and drank his water. It had gone cold. He did not mind. The Kreth science vessel did not have a warship sensors, but it had very good ones for reading rock and mineral density, and its passive arrays were picking up everything. The science crew had watched the entire engagement from their interior shelter. They were researchers, not soldiers. Most of them had never seen a real fight before. They had expected, when the rogue ships moved to flank them, that they were going to die. The math had seemed clear. Then the old human ship had arrived, and the math had changed in ways they did not know how to calculate. Oken was already compiling data. He could not help it. He was the kind of person who, when confronted with something he did not understand, immediately started building a file. He had the engagement time-stamped, the shot sequences logged, the hull impact data captured from his mineral scanner's secondary returns. He looked at the file and then he looked at it again. The ricochet shot in the second sequence, he said. That was not an accident. The bridge crew of the science vessel had come out of shelter. Its commander, a woman named Vale who had 20 years of deep space research postings and had never fired a weapon at anything, pulled up the trajectory data. She looked at it. No, she said, that was not an accident. She was quiet for a moment. They knew what the asteroid was made of before they fired. She opened a channel to the Resolute. Dara answered herself, which was unusual. Most captains let comms officers handle hailing traffic. Resolute, go ahead. Vale had prepared a formal acknowledgement. Standard Kreth protocol for a rescue situation involved specific gratitude language and an offer of formal debt registration. She had the words ready. She found that she did not use them. What she said instead was, "How long have you been flying this ship?" There was a pause from Dara's end, just long enough to suggest mild amusement. "She's been flying for 91 years. I've been with her for 14. Vale looked at the engagement data one more time. 14 years, she repeated, not to Dara, just to herself. The channel stayed open. They had practical matters to handle. The Resolute was going to take 2 of its crew members across to the science vessel to help with minor repair work, and the science vessel crew would start transferring the surviving data from their study mission, and both ships would begin the slow process of navigating back out of the corridor. While all of this was happening, on another part of the electromagnetic spectrum entirely, a message was moving fast toward the Kreth Dominion's nearest fleet position. Admiral Vorak received it on the bridge of his command ship, which was still docked at Outpost Farron. The message was from Vale. It was not long. It contained coordinates, a summary of the attack, the identity of the rogue vessels, and a single attached file, the engagement data that Oken had compiled. Vorak looked at the file. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. His tactical officer stood at a respectful distance and waited. Vorak was not a man who took being wrong easily, but he was also not a man who refused to see evidence. He had built his career on reading situations correctly. He looked at the data and he understood, in the precise and uncomfortable way of someone who has just realized they misjudged a threat, what the Resolute was. "Get my frigate ready," he said. "We are going into the corridor." His tactical officer blinked. "Admiral, the corridor's outer approach is—" "I know what the approach is." Vorak picked up his command jacket from the back of his chair. "Do it." He arrived at the corridor's outer edge 4 hours later, pushing his personal frigate through the outer passage at speeds that made his crew uncomfortable. He could not go deep. The frigate was too wide for the inner lanes, but he positioned himself at the entrance and waited, and watched his scope. The Resolute came out of the corridor first. Then the Kreth science vessel, moving slowly, following in the Resolute's path like something being guided home. Vorak looked at the Resolute on his scope. Both cargo sections still sealed from the emergency foam. One running light still flickering, a different one than before because the original had been knocked out by the second salvo and now a secondary had taken over. The ship was trailing a faint heat signature from the rerouted plasma conduit. Its hull looked exactly as it had looked in Berth 9. Old, patched, tired. He opened a channel. Dara answered. "You survived," Vorak said. He had not planned to say it that way. It came out flat, like a statement of evidence rather than a greeting. "We usually do," Dara said. Vorak looked at the Resolute on his scope for another moment. "I request permission to come aboard your vessel, Captain, formally, in my official capacity." There was a pause, not a hesitation, more like someone setting something down before picking up something else. "Permission granted, Admiral. I should mention that 2 of our guest sections lost atmosphere in the engagement. You'll want your suit." Vorak's aide began to say something about protocol, about the impropriety of an admiral of the Kreth Dominion boarding a foreign vessel in a damaged state. Vorak silenced him with a gesture. He boarded the Resolute in his suit. Dara met him in the main corridor, not the bridge, not a formal room, just the corridor, where the emergency amber lighting was still on and the walls showed patches of older paint under the newer paint, decade by decade, each repair job a slightly different shade. He walked the ship. He did not ask for a tour. He just walked, and Dara walked with him, and she answered the questions he asked and did not fill the silences with unnecessary words. He looked at the mechanical seal system that had closed the hull breaches. He looked at the tertiary power grid levers. He looked at the manual calibration mount on the targeting array. "Why does none of this run on software?" he asked. "Because software fails," Rost said from under a panel nearby, which surprised Vorak, who had not seen him. Rost came out, sat up, and wiped his hands. "Digital systems fail together. When one thing crashes, it takes the next thing with it. These systems fail separately. You lose one, the others keep working. The people who built this ship learned that the hard way. Twice." Vorak looked at the panel Rost had been working on. Plain metal, physical connections, nothing that could be hacked or jammed or corrupted by a power spike. "When I was at the docking level," Vorak said, and he said it the way someone says something they have decided to say rather than something that escaped them, "I made a judgment." "About this ship?" Dara said nothing. "I was wrong," Vorak said. He said it simply, without performance, the way a person states a measurement that came out different than expected. He had been wrong. The data said so. He accepted data. He left the ship an hour later. His aide noted, carefully, that the Admiral did not speak on the return journey. He sat and he looked at the engagement data on his personal screen, and he did not look up until they docked. Behind them, in the amber-lit corridors of the Resolute, Rost put the tertiary grid back to standby and started writing the part's request for the plasma coupling. The outer compact emergency session was held in a long room on Neutral Station Drev, which was the kind of place built for exactly this sort of gathering, clean walls, identical chairs for every delegate, lights calibrated to a neutral spectrum so that no species was disadvantaged by the color temperature. There were 41 delegates present. 9 of them were human. The rest represented 11 other member species of the Compact, including the Kreth Dominion and the Yundari Pact. The session had been called because of what the investigation had found in the 48 hours since the corridor incident. The rogue Yundari faction had been thorough, but not thorough enough. When the disabled attack ship was boarded by a compact security team, its navigation logs showed 14 previous operations, 3 of which touched compact member worlds. The financial records, recovered from a damaged but intact core, pointed back to a group inside the Yundari government's outer procurement office. People who believed that the compact was moving too slowly toward Yundari interests and had decided to accelerate the process by starting a war between the Kreth and the humans. The plan had required the Resolute to fail. This had seemed like the plan's most reliable element. Yundari-packed Commander Sale sat through the first hour of the session in silence because there was nothing useful he could say. His government had already issued a formal statement of condemnation before the session began. The conspirators had been arrested. Evidence had been handed over without negotiation. Sale was present not to defend but to witness, because his government understood that the only credible response to treachery of this scale was total transparency. And Sale was the kind of officer they sent when they wanted transparency to be embodied rather than just described. A Kreth delegate named Torvin, not Vorak, who had submitted a written statement and was absent by his own choice, presented the technical findings. He showed the engagement data. He walked through the attack sequence. He was methodical and precise in the way that Kreth officials were trained to be in formal settings. Then, near the end of the technical summary, he said something that changed the tone in the room. He said, "It should be noted that the human vessel that responded to this incident was the oldest active military hull in compact space. Its engagement record in this incident has been reviewed by 3 independent tactical analysis teams. Each team's conclusion was the same. The outcome was not fortunate. It was the result of superior applied knowledge of materials, terrain, and the opponent's limitations. The vessel performed as a frontline warship." Several delegates looked up from their reading screens. A Yundari junior delegate, young and still learning when to stay quiet, said, "The humans sent a 90-year-old ship as their border patrol. This is what passed for adequate preparation." The room shifted. Sale closed his eyes briefly. Torvin looked down at his papers. And then a door at the side of the room opened, and Admiral Vorak walked in. He had not been scheduled to speak. His written statement had been submitted and logged. Protocol was satisfied. Nobody had expected him to come in person, and the room registered his presence the way rooms do when someone arrives with weight behind them, a small, involuntary quiet. Vorak did not go to a delegate seat. He went to the presentation position at the front of the room, which required Torvin to step aside, which Torvin did without hesitation. Vorak stood there for a moment, then he spoke. "I laughed at that ship," he said. "I want this session to know that because I think it is relevant. I am an admiral of the Kreth Dominion. I have 31 years in active service. I walked past the UES Resolute at Outpost Farron, and I photographed it to send home as a joke. I want everyone in this room to understand the quality of that judgment." No one said anything. "I have read the full tactical analysis. I have been on that ship. I have spoken to its captain and its engineer." He paused. "What I will tell you is this. The people who built that vessel had been through 2 wars before they built it, not small conflicts. Wars that destroyed fleets, that collapsed stations, that killed hundreds of thousands of people. When they sat down to design a new ship, they did not design for optimal performance. They designed for survival. Every system has 4 alternatives. Every alternative can be operated by hand. The ship's hull is irregular because it has been repaired in the field, in the dark, under pressure, by people who used whatever material was available. This irregularity causes modern targeting systems to generate false readings. This was not a planned feature. It is a consequence of the ship having survived long enough to be repaired many times." He looked slowly around the room. His eyes stopped on the junior Yundari delegate who had spoken. "You asked whether this was adequate preparation." His voice did not change volume or pitch. It was perfectly even. The rogue faction chose the Resolute as the weak element in their plan. They assumed it would fail. My science vessel's crew is alive because it did not. I would suggest that any future assessment of what constitutes adequate preparation account for this fact. He left the room without filing an official appearance record, which meant the session technically had no documentation of his presence. His aide tried to raise this procedural issue. Vorak told him, quietly, to let it go. The resolution that passed at the end of the session condemned the rogue faction, approved the handover of the conspirators, and established a new joint patrol protocol for the Verath corridor. Buried in the administrative section, in language that took up exactly one line, it reclassified the UES Resolute from reserve patrol vessel to active frontier designation. There was no ceremony, no press release. The reclassification appeared in the fleet registry overnight, and most people who saw it assumed it was a routine administrative correction. Nara saw it. She showed it to Rost, who read it twice and then went back to work. She showed it to Dara, who looked at it for a moment and then said, "Put in the parts request for the engine component again. Reference the new designation this time. They might actually send it." They sent it. 3 weeks later, for the first time in 6 years, the Resolute's portside engine ran at exactly the correct temperature. Rost sat in the engine room and listened to it run. He did not smile, that was not the kind of person he was. But he stayed there for a long time just listening, the way you stay near something after a long time apart. Word spread the way things spread in space, slowly, and then all at once. Oken's engagement data file, which he had compiled as a personal research document, was shared with 3 colleagues. Those colleagues shared it with 11 more. Within a month it had traveled through 8 different species' academic and military networks. The file itself was technical shot sequences, hull stress data, targeting anomaly reports, but Oken had made one addition that people kept quoting. At the bottom of the file, after all the numbers, he had written a single paragraph. It said, "The Resolute was not effective because it was powerful. It was effective because it was honest. Every repair shows. Every modification is visible. The ship does not pretend to be something it is not, and because of this, every threat assessment made against it was wrong." This may be the most important tactical lesson of the Verath corridor incident. A ship that has survived everything looks nothing like a ship that was designed to look like it could. Nobody agreed on exactly what that meant, but everyone kept passing it around. 3 months after the corridor incident, the Outer Compact assembled a stabilization fleet at Rally Point Orvash. The region beyond it, a loose cluster of systems called the Draven Reach, had been deteriorating for 6 weeks. 2 minor species in the Reach had fallen into a territorial dispute that had started with contested mining rights and escalated to the exchange of actual fire. A third party had moved in to profit from the instability. A mercenary confederation called the Burn Chain, 12 ships of mixed origin, very fast, very aggressive, and until recently quite successful at picking apart undefended convoys and installations. The fleet that assembled at Orvash was substantial: Kreth destroyers, Yundari frigates, a human carrier group with 2 new cruisers, compact patrol vessels from 4 other member species, 43 ships in total. And the Resolute, which arrived last, from a different approach vector, because it had stopped along the way to investigate an anomalous beacon that turned out to be a broken navigation buoy that nobody else had been scheduled to check. It took its assigned position at the fleet's outer edge, not out of modesty, but because outer positions in a formation patrol required the most independent judgment and the least reliance on formation communication, and Dara preferred to work with room to move. The modern ships acknowledged its arrival in the fleet log. The Kreth destroyers, without being asked, moved 3 degrees to give it a slightly better position in the formation. It was a small gesture. It was noticed. The Burn Chain had been watching the fleet assemble through relay probes positioned around the rally point. Their commander was a man called Draze, who had built the Burn Chain from 4 ships to 12 over 8 years through a combination of tactical aggression and very accurate risk calculation. He was good at knowing which fights to take and which to avoid. He pulled up the fleet composition and worked through it systematically. The carrier group, leave alone. The Kreth destroyers, leave alone. The Undari frigates, manageable at range but not worth the engagement. The smaller compact vessels, low threat individually, but in formation they created crossfire problems. Then he got to the Resolute. His intelligence analyst had found the ship in the compact registry and pulled the entry. It was long because 91 years of registration history is a long entry, but the analyst summarized it. Old human patrol vessel, repeatedly decommissioned and reactivated, current designation Frontier Patrol, crew of 22, armament classified as light. The analyst had flagged it as a low-priority asset. Drays looked at the Resolute's position in the formation, edge placement, relatively isolated, and the intelligence read on it was, in his professional assessment, the softest target in the fleet. He made a decision. "We hit the old human ship first," he told his bridge crew. "Fast and public. We need the fleet to see that we are willing to engage, not just raid. One quick strike on the edge asset, then we pull back to the reach before they can reorient." He looked at the formation data. "They will not risk the formation to chase us, and after that the small species ships in the reach will start negotiating instead of waiting for protection that clearly cannot reach them fast enough." It was a sound plan. It was built on correct logic. Every assumption in it was reasonable. 6 of the burn chain's ships peeled off from their holding position and moved toward the fleet's edge at combat speed. Vorak, watching from his command vessel in the fleet center, saw the attack vector develop. He saw where it was aimed. He turned to his tactical officer and said, "Do not move our ships." His tactical officer looked at him. "Admiral, the protocol for formation defense." "I know the protocol," Vorak said. He did not look away from the scope. "Wait." Dara had been watching the burn chain ships since they left their holding position. She had 12 minutes while they crossed the distance. She spent 4 of them talking to Rost and Nara. The remaining 8 she spent doing something that looked, to anyone observing from outside, like nothing. She sat in her chair and she looked at the approach data and she thought. She thought about the speed of the incoming ships and the way fast ships committed to their attack vectors early because changing course at speed burned fuel they needed for retreat. She thought about the corridor and how much debris had helped her there. She thought about the burn chain's formation, 6 ships, spread wide to create a broad engagement front, which meant they were optimized for visual intimidation and simultaneous fire coverage, but not for tight coordination. When the burn chain ships got close enough for their targeting systems to lock, Dara did something none of them expected. She turned the Resolute broadside. Not to run, not to present a smaller profile. Broadside, offering the full length of the ship. In naval terms, this was a traditional aggressive posture. It meant you intended to fire everything you had along the longest axis. In modern combat, it was also considered tactically naive, because a broadside presented maximum surface area to incoming fire. What the burn chain's targeting systems did not know, what no targeting system reading the Resolute's profile ever correctly processed, was that the broadside of the Resolute was, electromagnetically, 3 ships at once. The burn chain opened fire, 14 shots, 7 missed entirely on bad targeting data, 4 hit sections that Rost had prepositioned as expendable, 3 hit solid hull. Nara fired the entire time they were firing. She had 17 rounds down before they finished their first salvo. Not all of them hit, 4 were deliberate misses, aimed at a debris cluster off their port approach that broke apart into a field they then had to navigate through. 2 ships collided with each other at low relative speed trying to avoid the debris. Not catastrophically, enough to knock one of them out of formation. The remaining 5 ships tried to regroup. Dara moved the Resolute into the debris field she had just created. The burn chain ships could not follow without risk. They spread out, trying to get around the edges. Rost came on the comm. "Grapple is ready." "Stand by," Dara said. The fastest burned chain ship came around the debris field's far edge, trying to get a clean angle. It was the most aggressive of the six, and it had outrun the others trying to find a shot. It was momentarily separated from the group by about 400 meters. Now, Dara said. The grapple was the oldest piece of equipment on the Resolute. It had been installed in the original build for exactly the reason its designers stated in the construction notes, because early human ships in deep space needed to be able to recover each other, and losing a ship because nothing could reach it was unacceptable. It was massive, mechanical, and hit the burned chain ship's engine cowl with a force that jerked the smaller vessel sideways and brought it to a hard stop. The ship could not accelerate. It could turn slowly, but every time it turned the grapple cable torqued and added stress to the engine housing. After 40 seconds, the pilot stopped trying and just went still. The other 4 burned chain ships were now looking at the Resolute from 4 different positions. One had debris damage. 2 had lost formation spacing and were working against each other's firing solutions. One was whole and ready. That one's pilot made a call that Drays, watching from the command position, later admitted was the right call. She broadcast on open channel, "Burned chain to attacking fleet. We are standing down, requesting parley terms." It took a moment for the word to reach Drays. When it did, he looked at his scope, where 6 of his ships had left to make a statement, and where 1 was caught on a cable and 3 others had taken varying degrees of damage, and where the old human ship sat in a debris field it had made from their own attack, still holding the grapple cable, still running, still there. He opened a channel to Dara directly. "What are you?" he asked. He did not mean it as an insult. He genuinely wanted to know. Dara looked at the grapple display, at the scope, at the fleet behind her. She thought about Voruk's question in the amber-lit corridor, which had been almost the same question, and the answer had been the same then too. "We're the Resolute," she said. "We've been out here for 91 years. We're not done yet." Drays surrendered. All 12 ships of the burned chain stood down within the hour. In the after-action review, Compact analysts noted that the Resolute had expended 17 rounds to achieve the outcome. Exactly 17, the same number as the corridor. Nara, reading the report, thought that was a coincidence. Then she thought about it more and decided it was not a coincidence. It was just what 17 well-placed rounds could do, in the hands of someone who had been manually calibrating that targeting array every day for over a year and knew exactly what it could reach. She went back to the calibration. It was not a thing that stayed done. It needed to be maintained, checked, adjusted, like everything on the Resolute, like the ship itself. Outside, in the dark and the cold, the Resolute held its position at the edge of the fleet. The running light that had been flickering for 3 months had finally been replaced. All lights were steady now. The engines ran at exact temperature. The hull showed every repair it had ever received, nothing hidden, nothing painted over. The whole long history of the ship visible in the welds and patches and slightly mismatched sections of plating. It looked exactly like what it was. A ship that had been everywhere, survived everything, and was not planning to stop. Somewhere in the fleet, a young Kreth officer who had pulled up the Resolute's registry entry out of curiosity sent a message to a colleague. It said, "I found the file on the old human ship. Do you know it has never been lost in 48 engagements?" The colleague wrote back, "48 now." The young officer looked at the Resolute on the scope for a long time after that. Then she filed a transfer request. First posting preference, Outpost Farron. Second preference, wherever the Resolute was currently docked. She did not expect to get it. She got it.